So today we have joining us Adam Gilmore from Gilmore Space. We have Amir Blackman from Axiom Space. We have Flavia Tatanardini from Fleet. And we have Troy McCann from Moonshot X. So welcome, panelists. It's really great to have you here. I want to kick off a conversation in a session, but just a quick bit of housekeeping, and for everybody that's joining us today live on this call, is we did actually seed some of these questions from your registrations, and we've tried to frame the conversation and start the kickoff of it about the things that you wanted to hear about and that you wanted to give a chance to ask the panelists. But we're also going to have a time for Q&A. So if you do have questions that are coming up during as you're hearing about what's exciting to our panelists today and what's making them strive and take the leaps forward that they're doing, please pop them in the Q&A function, and we'll get to those, as many of those as we possibly can during this session. So let's get into it. The first question that I have for all of you, and Adam, I might put you on the hook first for this, and then we can bounce around to all of us, is why space? I mean, you're interesting. You started as a career as a banker, but why space? What is it that excites you personally? And what's the problem that you're trying to solve with your company? And just get us excited. Some people out there are a bit daunted by space and they're not excited. We've got others that are fully on board. But what is it for you? What's that personal connection and that driver?
Thanks, Sally. I've always been interested in space from when I was a little boy. Life has mysterious twists and turns. So I became a banker for 20 years, but I never took my mind off space. And when I was a banker, we looked at industries. Banking is very, very focused on what's the next big thing. And space, to me, was one of the things I thought was going to be the next big thing. So I started doing a lot of research on the space industry in general. And, what were the pain points? What were the opportunities? And launch or access to space just seemed to be a really, really big challenge. So that's kind of where I focused on. And I just started doing a lot of study. Every time I went on a plane, I downloaded a whole lot of research papers and read them on the plane. So probably across 7 to 10 years, I picked up enough to have a good idea of what I wanted to do with technology and start hiring the first engineers. So I think space, you don't have to be an engineer to start a space company. You have to have a good idea. You have to do a lot of research. You eventually have to hire engineers, and most of the people in the company now are engineers. But I think anybody can start a space company as long as they've got some vision, passion, and do the research.
I love that. And I think it's a great place for us to kick off, because I know there's a lot of people on the call today that are definitely not engineers and not from an engineering background. So that's great. Flavia, let's go to you. Like, what is it about that drives you? I mean, I've look, full disclosure, I've heard you speak a lot of times and I know your passion, but can you capture that for a nutshell? What is it that drives you, and what is it that you're really on a mission to solve?
I'm a bit different from Adam because I'm a rocket scientist, a space engineer. So I'm the nerd founder. So it's probably the opposite side of the spectrum. Listen, all my life it's been around space, and I cannot even explain why. I've got 4 siblings. We are a big family and different type of engineers. And I was the only one that chooses space. That's just a space. But for me was space or nothing. Like since I was a little girl, I don't know. It's hard to explain. I think for me is what I'm in this world to do. Space is my purpose, is my passion. I would not do anything else if I'm not doing what I'm doing. So I think I'm one of the people that since 2 years old wants to do that. Why is space cool? Because as an engineer, there is nothing more complicated than space. As a human, there is nothing more exciting than space. Like, the idea of always pushing boundaries and making it happen. It's also a beautiful, very beautiful ecosystem. It's an amazing industry where everyone is driven by the same purpose, and it feels very fulfilling. What I want to achieve, there are several things that I want to do with Fleet and in my life. Well, I was discussing this the other day. I think the change in space startups is incredible, and try to bring a space startup to be a unicorn it's an incredible journey that I hope I will be able to perform because I really wanna feel how it feels like, to do probably the most complicated startup in the world and bring it to success. And we're not going to stop there. We live in the best time ever when Elon Musk is going to Mars and we are going with him. So there is everything to do and nothing that can stop us. So
I love it. It's so passionate. Your passion just shines through when you talk, and it's very infectious. Amir, let's go to you. You've got a space company as well. You're based over in the US. What is it that drives you, and what is the opportunity that gets you so excited that you're willing to invest? It's your life's work. For all of you, this is kind of your life's work.
Yeah, thanks, Sally. So first of all, I don't know how common the opening that you did today is in Australia. It never happens in the United States where people first acknowledge Native Americans. So it's that was new for me to see, and I think that was a beautiful opening, and I appreciate that you did that.
Oh, thank you.
So, there are things that are, and you already heard with Flavia and Adam, that I think are very ingrained to our genetics. So they're the same, for everybody in space. It's awe-inspiring. It's got adventure in it and sparks curiosity. And I think there are very few people that don't look up to the sky and feel some element of that. For me personally, I think I had some of the early ingredients, like Adam said he had early on, where it's events that happen in life or good teachers that planted a seed. So I started taking model rocketry classes when I was 7 years old at the Museum of Science and Industry here in Los Angeles, which is now called the California Science Center. And I had certain milestones in life that turned me on to space in ways that I probably didn't realize until much later. Like, on January 28th, I think it was 1984, when Challenger blew up, and we were in social studies class. They brought the television in, and the whole class was watching that together, and we saw that awful thing happen. And so, good or bad, it was a very strong shared experience. And later on, I was visiting in Israel, and a family friend of ours was a base commander in the Air Force, and put me in a Tomcat simulator, F-14 simulator. And so, a bunch of things happened throughout life that just really connected me with aerospace in one way or another. And so it's in my blood. I ended up being a pilot, and I love doing that. I love airplanes. I love rockets. I'm self-taught in propellants and propulsion, and Flavia and Adam would probably have more knowledge in their pinky than I do in the realm, but it's something I've always kind of tried to study. There are some things about what we do specifically at Axiom that attracted me to the company, because before Axiom, I ran a space investing firm. That firm has funded 38 different companies, but I always wanted to find something that had a few characteristics that was world improving, that directly or through its ripples had a positive effect on everybody in the world, that is challenging, and because it's an audacious mission, attracts great people with very, very different backgrounds, but all very ambitious and very talented people. So I can work in an environment that's stimulating, and so this industry, and specifically the company that I'm at, does that. I look at some other companies around, and I see that they have a lot of those characteristics. Like, for example, two that come to mind. One is Flavia's company, because they're developing a technology that uses space very directly and with a very, very broad distribution of their servers, of Fleet Space's servers, and the information that they can put out leads to better husbandry of resources, better knowledge of patterns of life, and things that we can use in all sorts of good ways. Then there are, companies that I've seen that do things that help in agriculture and cattle and construction, in emergency response, and so there's just so much good that you can do from space. And anyways, that's a long answer to all the things that attracted me to it.
I love that answer though, and we're going to come back and dig into some of that in a moment, because normally in the space conversation you don't start talking about agriculture in the same context, and I think we want to dig into that a bit more. But last but definitely not least, Troy, I would love for you to talk about your interest in space, because you're in a really different, a different space of space, but in a different field, in wanting to enable so many more companies and businesses to come to life and both harness the opportunity in space, but also create space-enabled businesses. So please share with us, what is it that fuels you, and what is it that you really want to see? What do you want to achieve through Moonshot?
Yeah, thanks so much, Sally Ann. Yeah, so it is interesting because I am an engineer, but I'm in a bit of a different space because I'm not developing technology myself. And so I've been fascinated by space ever since I was a little kid. And I'm sure Adam was in the same situation as this. I never thought that I could work in space. Never thought it was going to be an opportunity. So I found myself doing a whole lot of technology-based things growing up. Very interested in technology and how we can use that to solve people's problems. And then discovered that space is sort of making a comeback about, it was about 6-7 years ago now. So we saw that I was doing my engineering degree at University of Melbourne and saw that there was a group of high school kids in the US building literal satellites made out of the same components of smartphones. And I said, well, why can't we try doing that? And so that was sort of a gateway drug to discovering the opportunities for space, that everyone can get involved now. This was pre-Australian Space Agency. So we ended up discovering that space law was going to be our greatest challenge, not necessarily the actual engineering of the satellites. So we ended up getting law students coming in, and we got involved in the formation of the Australian Space Agency at this time, that we were all realizing that space is not just for, this academic project that we were doing. There's real commercial opportunity. And so my understanding of space has really shifted over the last little while. And I think that's the most fascinating thing, is that we sort of see space as this one location that's just beyond Earth. But I see it as though we've got access to these new different frontier locations, from low Earth orbit to the moon and Mars. They're all different. Even the deep ocean, it's a new part of space that we have access to. And they give us new perspectives to solve really big problems. As Amir was saying, from agriculture to mining to education, logistics, space, the infrastructure that we're putting into space is really starting to increasingly underpin everything that we do. And not only that, it's becoming increasingly accessible for us to build the technologies. The average person can now start a space company. And we're starting to look at, we're developing new supply chains and value chains where, fleet, will really need to use Atom services to get stuff into space. And fleet will be able, you'll be able to use fleet as a platform for building new products and services that address terrestrial problems using the communications platforms that they're producing. So I love the space because it's not only about frontiers and new technologies and bringing those things together, but it's also about working with great people. And I'm really excited because the people that we have here, from Adam, Amir, and Flavia, they're investors and mentors in Moonshot and the community that we're trying to grow, and growing that platform of the rising tide, as we call it, so that people can understand what opportunities are there and how they can get involved in the new space sector, and use their genius and their amazing abilities to grow new big solutions to the world's biggest problems.
I did the mute thing. So thank you for that. I really love it. I actually want to dig in, and I'm going to throw this open to all of the panel. I want to pick up on something that Troy, you've sort of touched on. Amir, you kind of really went there about the enabling of space and technologies, and thinking about the companies that you either are your companies or the companies that you work with and mentor. If you put on the lens of somebody who is not a space geek for a moment, so none of you, but if you put on the lens of somebody who goes, well, space, it's all about rockets, it is all about going there. What does that mean for me, the individual? How can I unpack that? How's that going to have an impact on my life? What is that as an enabler for? Could you tell us some of the sort of, maybe paint a picture for that, of what the impact could be on agriculture, on sustainability? How do people kind of see the outputs of the work that you're doing? Because sometimes when we're talking about these things, it's so technical and it's not direct to consumer. So consumers miss the magic of what it is, but they do touch the end result. So, Flavia, I feel like this is one for you that you could touch on quite well about the outputs.
Yeah, let me talk about it. It kind of, I saw that it was someone that asked a question a few minutes ago that was like, what's the role of government in space, and why Australia is positioning, to be, and I think these things are connected, because space startups are changing since people like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, made a lot of money in the software.com revolution and spending them all, in space. But forget about the rocket. What they've demonstrated in the past 20 years is that infrastructure costs are going down. Okay. For people that are not space people, this is a really important concept. So think about computers. I always give the example of that beautiful movie Hidden Figures, in which the women are helping the Apollo mission. In that movie, there is a part in which they buy an IBM computer and they actually have to destroy the door to let it in. It's a huge computer. It's massive. It's like 10 meters. And it's got less computational power than an iPhone. That's just the reality, okay? So all the change that we have seen the world doing from big computer to smartphone and how it changed our life in ways that we are used to now. And it's just fascinating, that these little things you got in your hand can do anything, okay? In space, it's happening the same. Infrastructure are changing. So when our computer was very, very big, who was using the computer? Big companies. At a supercomputer in their basement, at a supercomputer on the third floor, universities. Now that the computational power is in an iPhone, who uses the iPhone? Who uses the internet? Everyone. Every single person on Earth. So space is happening the same. So because of big changes, we got smaller satellites, smaller rockets. So what it means that the infrastructure cost, that the availability of that data is accessible to everyone in terms of cost. Look at Earth. Okay, I'll give you an example of fleet. Earth is huge, okay, huge. And in the past 20 years, we've been really, really careful to create all GSM infrastructure, right? 3G, 4G, to cover people. GSM covers 4% of Earth. 4% of Earth. Like we think that, GSM covers us because, we have our phone and iPhone, but 4% of Earth is tiny. So it means that, most of the industry are there, environmental. So if you think about mining, if you think about oil and gas, agriculture, transport, every single environmental concept, rivers, seas, oceans, mountains, you name it, they are unconnected, purely, totally not connected. So there is no GSM, there is nothing, there is no access. We are going to Mars and we cannot even connect our backyard. And this is not because we don't want to. It's because space is the only place where you see all Earth. You can connect everything instead of, and this is what drove me to build Fleet. We now have the ability to put networks in the sky, internet in the sky that is low cost, that is relevant, that is completely disrupting the way connectivity was done before. And this enables million applications for people on Earth that would never be able to be deployed before. Because satellites were expensive, we're talking about $1 billion. So imagine if you are in an energy company and you are regulating the distribution and transmission network of energy. This is the energy that we have. You got it in front of you. And sometimes you got some outages. In 2 hours you are without, you're like, oh, what the hell, what's happening? Okay, why 2 hours? Why can't I fix it straight away? You know why can't I fix it straight away? Because I got 1 million poles in the middle of New South Wales. This is how many Essential has. And 50 or 60% of them are without connectivity. And if something breaks, they don't know. Because they don't know. So how do you do it? This is why these small satellites and these space technologies are changing the world, because now allows the cost to go down and allows every single thing to be tracked and monitored. That is a huge change. Imagine agriculture, animals. There are farms in Australia as big as Belgium, and they're totally unconnected. So what it fascinates me that in 2020, our main industries, our remote communities, our nature, and all the problem we have with climate changes and fires and inefficiency of power lines, gas pipelines, mining, agriculture, just you name it, okay, is due to the lack of infrastructure. But now space is coming in. So if I look at my customers, I've seen it all. I've seen people connecting beehives. I've seen people connecting soil moisture sensors in huge farm. I've seen people connecting animals. I've seen people connecting poles, millions of volts in energy network, connecting gas pipelines, connecting water. Like they're the biggest hydroelectric company in the world. They've got 100 kilometers of water pipelines unconnected. So we waste an enormous amount of water, an enormous amount of resources because we do not monitor them. I mean, Fleet does IoT. We don't take photos. So another beautiful concept is Earth observation and taking photo. What I'm trying to explain that Adam is building a rocket for me to launch a satellite, but this doesn't care. This doesn't have to impact your life. What's going to impact your life is when you work in a company and you're able to put sensors to measure temperature, vibration, health, anything you want, because they are low cost. The connectivity costs $1 instead of $1 million, okay? And then suddenly the world is digitalized. That's cool. So we are working to launch rocket, launching satellites. It's a hell of a work for you to connect your stuff. And this is exciting.
It's really exciting. Your passion is absolutely, it shines through. And I think there's a couple of things that I sort of have really heard there and taking away around the democratization of space, because when you're making it accessible to people to build things and maybe start companies that they hadn't thought they could have before, that's game changing, but also accessibility in terms of the other output and thinking about space. You know, the challenge I hear is there to think about space as a platform and an enabler of other things, and not as a vertical solely on its own, but as a real enabler of what you want to achieve. You know, I'd just throw this open to the rest of the panel. Did anybody want to have anything that's just jumping out, the burning that you want to sort of say to people about this and add to this?
I'd like to add, go ahead, Alan.
No, you go ahead.
Oh, yeah, Troy, okay. I have to precede it with what do we do at Axiom. So there are two phases to our business. Right now, we are the only private company in the world that sends missions to the International Space Station, almost acting as sort of a private space agency, both for space agency customers around the world and for private companies and institutes that want to do manufacturing and research on orbit, and for high net worth individuals that want to fly to orbit, not suborbital missions that go up and quickly back down, but actually want to do full astronaut training and go up to space for longer than a week. That's what we do right now, missions to the International Space Station. We're also building the commercial space station that will succeed ISS. So the International Space Station will be retired somewhere between 2028 and 2030. And so in 2024, we will launch our first module of our new space station to orbit. We'll connect it to the International Space Station. We'll add more modules over a period of 4 years. And when ISS is ready to be retired, will separate from ISS. It will gradually deorbit into the atmosphere where it will vaporize and will stay up in space as the new space station. And so what we're building is an enabling platform for all sorts of different work on orbit. So human spaceflight is part of it, and human spaceflight serves the purpose both of teaching us how to live and work in space, which is something that has been learned for 20 years aboard the International Space Station, and prior to that with all the other missions that preceded it. And it's also the location where we prepare astronauts and equipment to go on longer duration missions to deeper space, to the moon and to Mars. And so that's one side, is the human spaceflight side of what we do. The other side, which touches on this question, is manufacturing and research. On the International Space Station today, at any given moment, there are about 200 experiments going on. So in the 20 years that ISS has existed, there have been thousands of experiments in pharmaceuticals and materials science and Earth observation and astronomy and in pure experimentation in physics and chemistry. And now we're getting into all sorts of new realms like 3D bioprinting of human tissues and protein crystallography, which has been done in space now for 30 years, actually even longer. And that gives us the ability to understand DNA structures and metabolic processes, so pharmaceuticals can be developed at a higher quality and in ways that can't be done on Earth. We're learning new ways to pull fiber optics in space, so we get materials that can transmit infrared signal and don't have signal loss, and that has huge application for connecting continents and connecting financial centers. There are foundries for integrated circuits, so silicon carbide wafers that you can make in space that you can't make on Earth, and all sorts of other materials, metamaterials like alloys. So now you're asking, well, how does that impact us here on Earth? It's everything from clean water technology to new manufacturing techniques, to new drugs, new implants for people who have tissue damage or are dealing with disease. So, I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And so when we look at the platform that we're building on orbit, people say, well, how big is your market? I tell them it's a very difficult question to answer. If I just look at the known use cases, this is how many billion per year our revenue will be by 2030. But that's like asking me, how big is the market going to be for the internet in 1995? I can tell you what some of the likely cases are, but look what it's become. And that's really what we envision for this. So we're building a station that is truly modular. It's not like the International Space Station that went up one piece at a time and was built into a single system that now cannot be decoupled. We're building a modular system. We're building it staggered over time. So as the oldest pieces age out, we'll replace them with new pieces, and it will continue to grow and grow, right? So it's not going to be that we're building Elysium all at once, but over a period of years, every number of years or so, we'll double the number of people on orbit. We'll support the lunar and Mars missions. But the biggest thing will be building support systems for myriad industries on Earth, and that'll get bigger and bigger in space over time. So big ripples.
I love it. There's such a big vision here in what you're all talking about. You know, we're talking multi-decadal. You know, there's the what to do now and the multi-decadal piece of how we get there. Thinking about that, I want to just pivot the conversation to just a couple of questions that are coming in and some that we have on here. You know, democratizing space is one thing, you know, these really big, ambitious things that are going to impact humanity in hopefully a really positive way. You know, there seems to be that this is also a place that's really challenging. I think it's, you know, referenced earlier that it took a very long time, and referenced in some of the comments in the chat, it took a very long time for Australia to get a space agency. We may not go into the history there. I know that that's been a tough battle that many of you have been involved with, and so we appreciate that. But what are some of the challenges moving forward from a regulatory perspective, you know, thinking about it and how we manage space and some of those regulations is really challenging. There was this great story, I think it was just yesterday, that I saw about the International Space Station having to produce a maneuver to move out of the way of debris in space. And so, you know, how do you deal with that? How do you plan for that? How are you thinking about regulation? What's working, what's not working? Because there's both Australian regulation, there's global regulation, and you know, what do we deal with this situation? Because I imagine, I mean, I think each and every one of you would have a challenge in this space. So I'd love to get your perspectives and your thoughts on it, and how do we actually make sure that we are creating a clear pathway, not just for Australian space companies, but globally, to really, you know, have that opportunity.
I'll start. I'm sure everybody can say the same thing, but I think what's going to happen in the very short term is that people are going to realize that there's an impending space junk problem, and more rockets are going up deploying payloads into low Earth orbit, and the current regulations or rules, you've got to deorbit within 25 years, and I think that will be lowered down into about 5 years. And that's going to make things pretty interesting, because if you are at an altitude, say above 500 kilometers above the Earth, you won't come back down within 5 years. So you're going to have people that go up and grab dead satellites and move them down into lower orbits. You're going to have the upper stages of all the rockets have some propulsion systems on that turn them around and deorbit them. So I think it's going to be a very, very different way of accessing and moving around in space. And it's going to be necessary because there's just so many satellites going up there. You know, if Elon even puts up half of what he wants to put up, there's going to be 20,000 small sats in low Earth orbit in the next 5 or 6 years. That's going to be pretty crazy.
It's a big challenge. How do we deal with it?
Well, so like I said, I'm an engineer, but I've my first sort of real sort of big push into the commercial space was discovery of space law as a concept. And so if you're a lawyer or a law student and haven't heard of space law, go and look it up, because I think it's one of the most fascinating areas of law that you can find. And there's a lot of really interesting discussions going on at the moment, both on the national level and international level, and how we should collaborate with space, because it's, you know, if we look at low Earth orbit, or Earth orbit, I should say, it's the physics and how things work there is just incredibly different to anything that happens on Earth. If you put something into space, it's literally going over everybody's sky. So how do you make sure that, you know, everyone's going to be happy with what's happening, and how do you make sure that everyone is on board with not creating a tragedy of the common situation where, for example, if you put up 40,000 satellites into some really, really valuable orbits that nobody else can access, you know, how do you make sure it's fair and equitable, you know, people can still get there and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of ongoing conversations happening on each of these different levels on how we should be doing this. And so a lot of the geopolitical discussions that are happening internationally now are very much focused on space too. And that's where you get things like Space Force in the US, and a lot of people still think it's a joke or just a TV show, but it's actually really important. It's a really, really valuable thing to have. And we're having similar conversations here in Australia too. And then on the national level, it's really interesting in terms of, you know, I kind of want to throw it back to Adam a little bit with regards to launch regulations, because one of the great things of getting a space agency in Australia over the last few years is that we have updated our very, very outdated regulations for space. It was essentially impossible from like 1998 onwards, essentially impossible to do anything in space as an Australian citizen or an Australian company. And so that started to be wound back. So the way that the laws work is that internationally, basically every country have signed treaties with each other. There's a really main one called the Outer Space Treaty on how we should do outer space stuff nicely to each other. It's relatively vague, and it's really interesting to kind of have a read through it. The average person can read it, so give it a crack if you want. But the interesting thing on the national level is that every nation then takes that, they've signed it, and they then try to implement their own local laws on what people should and shouldn't be able to do. Because if you do something in space, you know, if Adam launches a rocket or Flavia has a satellite and it crashes into Emir's space station, that's a big international problem. So the Commonwealth of Australia would be responsible from that point onwards. So we're implementing these new laws and regulations at the moment, and it's very interesting having the conversations with the Australian Space Agency around, you know, what is a high-powered rocket? Is it a university rocket that just happens to have some little like mechanical flaps on it? Is that really high-powered? Don't know. So how do you define these things on, you know, where the edge of space is? We generally say and accept it's at about 100 kilometers, but that's still something it's not really clearly defined anywhere. And so these kinds of discussions are all happening constantly, and we've got this industry. So one of the interesting things with space is that, you know, 50, 60 years ago, the push to space was very political. There was no real economic incentive to go to space. That's changed, and that's what's different now. Like now is the time for space because we've got the global economy literally trying to expand to use these new locations we have access to. And so I feel like I'm rambling on a little bit, but so we've got, you know, so we've got the industry in Australia that are looking to go into space and to use this, and we've got great startups like Gilmore, and we've got Flavia, and we've got much more smaller ones that we're working with at Moonshot as well. How do we make sure that the regulations are coming into effect that will enable them to do what they need to do, as well as protecting, you know, they're obviously there for a reason as well. How do we protect all the things that we need to with space? So there's ongoing discussions. I'm not sure if we have clear solutions to everything yet, but it is really interesting. Adam, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about how you guys are going with the launch regulations and getting into space past that 100 kilometer distance point.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be very quick. I think it's early days, and the space agency has a list of rules, but what they haven't said is how to interpret the rules. So if I gave a quick example, it's like, oh, you got to make your rocket safe. And we're like, okay, cool. And then I can say, well, I'm going to make my rocket safe from this, and this. And then they say, no, that's not enough. And then you say, okay, well, I add this and this and this, and no, it's still not enough. So we would love them to have a template like Defence has for a lot of stuff, where you can just fill out all the forms, submit it. And I think they will do that. I think once one or two successful applications get put in, they'll use those applications as a template. And I think that's what the angst in the industry is, that quite a number of people have submitted applications and they're not getting passed because it's very vague what a pass requirement is. But I think it'll be sorted out with time.
I think that's a really interesting thing that you raised there, right? What that touches on is the fact that we've moved from space from being something political, that it was governments that were doing, to companies, and it's an economical thing, and regulation hasn't necessarily been created yet to enable that. And we see this all the time. It's not something new. We've actually seen this in the internet. We've seen this with, you know, search engines, with platforms, with self-driving cars. You know, the list goes on and on and on. Is when a business or when industry decides to drive something forward at a pace outside of government driving it. That's where this really interesting friction comes along, and everyone goes, oh, we need to regulate that, but what should we do? I want to flip that conversation then about, you know, and throw this open to all of you. And I'm thinking specifically a little bit about Australia here, but I guess it's a global context, because you don't build a space company from Australia and not actually think that you're serving, you're working, your entire market is the world, right? It's not just Australia. But if you think about the Australian context for a moment, and space companies in Australia in particular, you know, what are the barriers that you'd like to see addressed, and what are the things that you think are enablers, and, you know, that are really a natural capabilities or assets that we have to drive this opportunity forward? And Amira, it'd be really interesting to get your perspective. You know, you're based in LA, your company's there, but obviously, you know, there's some things in Australia that we would have unique as our assets and our talents and our capabilities as well. And sometimes, you know, I'll be frank, coming from where I come from, where I used to work, sometimes we would launch things in countries because of it was easier to launch where there was unclear regulation about some of those products and services. But I'd love to get your thoughts, all of your thoughts about, you know, what are the enablers and what are the inhibitors, and what should we be thinking about?
So the good news is Australia's challenges, or I should say young Australian space companies or Australian space entrepreneurs, challenges are not unique to Australia. And that's good news, because it means that there are probably solutions that are coming together on a global level. Corona, ironically, has forced us into a much more virtual world. So that brings the whole planet closer together in a way, and opens up conversations forcefully that, you know, in the past people would have just said, well, you know, I can't fly there, or they're not as accessible to me, or whatever. We're all on Zoom today. It doesn't matter where you are. So that's helped a little bit. But let me go back to the idea of why this is not a unique problem. So when I was doing more space investing, I got approached from folks in Australia, in Europe, in Israel, in Brazil, and each country has different barriers. And for some countries, it's distance. For some countries, it's language. For some countries, it's not having an ecosystem. And so everybody's got kind of a little bit of a different challenge. And I think that the best way for companies to overcome that is find out, essentially to ask themselves, well, if I had everything I needed here, what would those things be? And then, given that we're in such a virtual world right now, just reach out to those same people that you wish you had next door in another country and work with them as if they're next door, and then figure out the international issues afterwards, because they're usually not insurmountable. Except of course for physical shipping and distance, which for most space companies is not going to be what makes or breaks things. So so in that sense, there's a problem, and there's also a solution in being able to reach out to people quite quickly right now. I think the issue of not having a workforce locally is probably the biggest issue, and you know, not being able to attract talent very easily, visa issues, things like that are a real challenge. And those are things that you can't very easily solve by just, you know, having somebody work by Zoom permanently. So that's a real challenge. And that might necessitate a company to move, or to pay relocation fees, or to sponsor people. So that's an issue that can't be too easily solved. And if I think of other problems that come up in solutions, I'll let you know. But one big solution, which Troy has already started to solve, is building an investment ecosystem, and most importantly, an awareness and a connection between folks on the government side and folks in the entrepreneurial realm. And so those bridges take years and years to build. So so it's good that Troy started planting those trees a few years ago.
Yeah, thanks. I might quickly jump onto the back of that. Thanks for handballing that over to me as well. Because I was going to say that, I think one of the most valuable things is being able to have those connections, and just as hard as it is to understand, well, what are the opportunities for space, with, the skill sets that you have, and what can you do? It's also really hard to work out, well, how do I connect with the groups around the world that are working within my realm of, potential partners and suppliers and customers and that kind of thing. And that's why, like, one of the big things that we've done at Moonshot in trying to put together this ecosystem that literally spans the globe is helping people connect with those various groups, and so you can understand better, well, who is actually out there, and how do I actually reach them, and how do I make sure that I'm actually solving problems that are really valuable. So I guess quick shameless plug, like, if you are really interested in space and entrepreneurship, do reach out to us, because it's really important to have, one thing, a lot of groups say, oh yeah, Moonshot's an accelerator, or Moonshot's an investment fund. These are things that we have, but that's not why we do them. So yes, we know that startups need better access to capital. They need better access to people that understand the regulatory side, like we just spoke about. They need connections to people, and other networks across the globe. And that's what we do at Moonshot. We try to make sure that people have access to these things that are really, really difficult to get access to otherwise. And that's really our kind of, accelerator to help you streamline and reduce the friction in building these space companies.
Flavia, Adam, do you want to add anything to that?
The only thing that I want to add is, and I think it's going to be a summary of a bit of the past 3 conversations that I was involved with. The situation is actually quite positive. Like, in regulations, there's a lot of regulations. I mean, this is not Wild West. I mean, it's very regulated. For people that are not space people, I spend millions of dollars a year for licenses and regulation. I can't just launch my satellite in space. It doesn't work this way. Okay, space is complex, and no matter what you can build. And if you look about the ecosystem, what really incredible is happening in Australia is that it's a very commercial focused ecosystem. So it's really is, because the agency is not huge, it's really hard to invest in science. And science, Australia is really good at investing in science anyway. So it's focusing attention on startups, scale-ups, SMEs that want to solve downstream problems and the supply chain in order to do that. So it's very, very focused. I mean, Adam and I, we have investors that got millions and $1 million funds. And, and there's VCs in Australia have never invested in space, and now they're investing. So it's not that bad. The big thing that I see, I keep repeating that I've seen happening, is that a couple of space startups like us and Mariota and a few others raised capital 5 years ago, and now there is nothing happened for 5 years. And this is quite typical because it's the moment in which that is the growth of this in this ecosystem, people risky and jumping in. So I think the real big problem is, and now there are hundreds of space startups without, fortunately, people. I mean, I'm an engineer, but my co-founders are an engineer. And if you ask me, what's the key of creating a space startup, and Adam was talking about that, is understanding a business model. That's it. Okay. So in the past 3 years, you see hundreds of engineers going out of university, of not engineers that want to build a startup with no sense whatsoever how to make money fast, because a space startup is not a software startup. You need to launch something in space to have a better service of anything you do. So it's not the same. So it needs a big brain, a big understanding of business model. So it's been this 5 years of nothing, with a lot of companies built by 3 engineers and 7 engineers. And the only advice I give is get the financial people to support you. Get the financial co-founders, get business people from the software revolution. Otherwise, you're never going to make it. And what Troy is going to try to do the next 3 years is, I mentor so many companies, and it's just sad seeing not going anywhere. And 7 engineers co-founded a company. It is time to bring financial people that are outside of the space industry, because this was success for me, and this was success for Adam. There are millions of dollars that these investors want to invest in startups. So let's don't say there are no money. There is plenty of money. There is plenty of customers. There is no knowledge of how to build a space startup. It is really hard because it's not a revenue-based company. Like Adam, to the moment that it needs to get to revenue, it's not like building a software. It's years in the making.
Yeah.
Okay, so what kind of vision? We are luckier because launching satellites, using other satellites network, we can demonstrate the go-to-market strategies, we can demonstrate the business model, but this is hard work. So I think what the space startup ecosystem needs, not money, there are money, not customers, there are customers, not infrastructure, there are infrastructure, not good people, there are amazing people. What it needs is understanding how to make business.
Yeah. I love
it's very important what Flavia is saying. You know, I remember often being at space conferences and seeing the same faces and asking myself, why are all of these founders at these space conferences instead of being at the blockchain conferences and at the family office conferences and at the sovereign wealth conferences and, you know, where the money is to, you know, to put gas in the tank. And why are they not at the conferences of their customer bases? So if you're serving the agriculture community, go to a farming convention. Don't go to another space conference.
Yeah.
This is what we talk. Sorry, Sally. I know you probably want to jump in. Yeah, we call it, you know, bursting the space bubble. It's one of the, I think, the big sort of key differentiators of Moonshot to a lot of other groups that are trying to sort of do space stuff. And it's, you know, it really is this key thing. And well, space isn't impossible anymore. That's the first thing, but it's also accessible to everyone. And like Flavia said, you know, we need people with banking experience. We need people with marketing experience. We need people who know how to build businesses. We need all kinds of people. And there are real opportunities for that, even in terms of the business model. So we sort of circling back to the beginning of the conversation, you know, if you're in finance and you want to build, you know, a financial related business for investing, for example, you know, one of the great examples of space technology that I love is that a few years ago, there was a company, Orbital Insights, there's a number of them that do it now. They took satellite data and they started looking at, well, where are the known oil drilling sites around the globe? They created a computer vision algorithm to automatically identify these things. Long story short, it's pretty cool. We'll get, if you could get into the engineering, but you know, they can tell exactly how much volume of oil has been drilled out of the ground and put into oil tanks. And looking at the difference between one day to the next, you can say, you can work out exactly how much oil has been drilled out of the surface of the planet, where it came from, and use that information for trading commodities on the markets. You know, even I think it was Walmart in the US were using satellites to detect traffic going in and out of their car parks and use that metric to optimize the layout of their Walmart stores. And that was effective. We can use space in a whole range of different areas. It doesn't necessarily just have to be the really deep tech, you know, rockets and satellites, that kind of thing. It could be further down the supply chain in a whole range of different areas, but people just need to know that they're out there, and we need more people from outside. We need to burst that bubble so that everyone really understands that space is for everybody. It's for you as well. Yeah.
Thanks for that. Just want to circle back to sort of the comments that Amir and Flavia were making, because I think this is actually really important, and I think it speaks to the work that you're doing, Adam, as well, around the timeframes and deep tech and having a different mindset, not just from an investment perspective, but from a government regulations perspective, but also the community. So we did an analysis. You know, we're a deep tech incubator. We've been around for 20 years, and we commissioned a report recently about Australia's deep tech opportunity. And we were covering all aspects of deep tech, not just a focus on space. But the really interesting thing when you pick this apart, and I think it reigns true for space too, is that the business model is different. And that life cycle is different. And we're not talking about a company coming from an idea to necessarily launching a product to market in 1 year, 3 years, 5 years. We're sometimes talking about 30 years. And I think that's something that conceptually, when we hear that, we really struggle with it because it's not our lived experience and it's not our shared experience and when we've been on it. But when we actually look at something like a technology that we all use and we all are enabled by every single day and our businesses all run on, Wi-Fi took 40 years to actually be a platform in market that everybody was building on top of. You know, it actually started way back in the 60s. And so Wi-Fi, ResMed, you know, Cochlear, these are all 30-year journeys. And so that sort of resilience and that timescale and that longevity factor and that return on investment factor is just completely different from the normal timeframes. And so building a community and an ecosystem of support for the long term to nurture right the way from those early days all the way through is really critical. I'm just conscious of time, and I wanted to ask a question to each and every panelist here, and it's probably going to be my final question, I'm guessing, just because I think of where the answers might go. If you wanted to cast a vision for the future, there's lots of people on here that have had questions about, you know, the opportunities in space. I think they're all excited. They, you know, want to engage from different disciplines. But if you had one piece of wisdom or advice or inspiration that you could say to our audience here today about space and sort of the future that you're excited about, you know, what would that be? And we might go, because in order of my screen, and because I've got the microphone, so to speak, we might go Troy, Flavia, Amir, and Adam.
Yeah, sure. So I think like the biggest piece of advice, if I could pinpoint it down to one thing, it would be, I guess, to be honest, to begin with, don't think about it. Don't start with thinking about space. Think about, you know, what these perspectives might be able to afford you in solving a really big problem. Like you have to start with the problem. You have to start with, okay, what is there actually a business case here? And I say that because the opposite that most people start off with is a technology. Don't start with the technology because there's roughly like 200 launch companies out there at the moment because people see space and they're like, well, I want to build a rocket. Not everyone's going to be able to build the rocket company. I think, so you need to really focus on, well, what problem are you solving and what market is there for you? But biggest piece of advice is start drawing it out. Like actually take some steps to say, look, if you've got an idea, start planning it out, come and reach out to us and we'll help you sort of take it to that next level. And don't just have an idea and let it percolate and not to do anything with it. You actually need to run small experiments to see if there's some real value there.
AKA borrow from Nike, just do it.
That's right.
Flavia?
There is something that for every person in the audience that's thinking or pondering if a space startup or it's for them. You don't have to start one. You can work in one as well to just start the feeling a little bit. I have 45 people at Fleet now and 25 are engineers. The rest is marketing and sales. So, you know, you can do everything really you want. But important things that I really want to tell everyone is, yeah, business model. And, you know, me and Troy and everyone is hammering on this, but space is cool. Like, and you got just one lifetime and, you know, just one to do your stuff. And you're very, very lucky that what's happening in the next 20 years is that we're going back to the moon. We're going back to Mars. There's an explosion of opportunities. And you, every 110 attendants of this call can put a satellite in space. Okay, can put another one and can do exactly what you want to do. So it's the biggest game on earth.
Love it. So just do it. Space is cool. Amir, no pressure.
None felt. There are a few things I would take in. One is be practical. Space, like anything, is a business. If you're running a business in it, it's a business, and don't forget that it's a business. There's, you know, from afar, people might look and think space people are, I don't know, dreamers or something different than any other type of thing, or that space somehow is different than any other industry. It's a business. Second is don't go in blind. This, like any industry, like the medical field or well, any field, it has some very, very deep idiosyncrasies, and it's very important to be as knowledgeable as possible before, and you know, setting off on any journey. Not to the point where, you know, it's analysis paralysis, but it's very good to be educated. And one of the best ways to be educated is to be partnered with the right people. And so if you don't have the education yourself, is get people on the team that are very educated and skilled in what you want to do. Another thing is, you know, a lot of times when people go to startup companies, they're given the advice that it's going to be 2 times as expensive and takes 3 times as long. In space, it's probably going to be 5 times as expensive and take 10 times as long. And that's not an exaggeration. And so a business plan should really build in that kind of buffer. And for entrepreneurs, they should be very honest with themselves if where they are in their lives, they can stomach that delay and cost. And if the framework that they're building around themselves can support that. And then lastly, it is the same effort to do something big as it is to do something small. And so if someone's going to set off to start a company, try and do something that's going to move the needle.
This is so true.
I love it.
This is so true.
It's like words of wisdom. If I could write a book on those kind of 5 things that you just went through there, I would. So, but I'm gonna pick one of them. So just do it. Space is cool. Space is cool. Space is a business. I really, really love that, because we do need to ground it in that. Adam.
Is that meeting? I think there's been a lot of attention in space on technology, and the panel's covered this a bit, but I want to emphasize it, and not really on what you can do from space. And if you think of what's been going on lately, people are putting up more and more sensors in space. You know, Flavia's got sensors and, you know, radio frequency things that are doing Internet of Things, which is this huge opportunity. But, you know, as a guess, I'd say there's between 20 and 100 different types of sensors that you can put into space to look down and communicate with Earth. And I think the next opportunity is to say, what are the business opportunities of those sensors? Because the easy ones have been done, you know, monitoring ships on the sea and stuff like that. But what is next? And something I've been very happy to see is we're talking to satellite companies all over the world, and some of them are coming up with new business opportunities for the same sensor that's been in space for 5 years. And I think, wow, that's a really cool idea. I didn't think of that, but good on you for thinking about that. So I think that's something that I don't think necessarily needs a lot of capital. But, you know, if you have an awareness of what's already up there, what's available to go up there, and how can I monetize that? That's really the same analogy as the internet. People said, you know, when the internet was formed, no one had any idea that Facebook was going to be a $600 billion company. You know, Jeff Bezos had no idea he was going to make so much money out of Amazon. He just didn't have that. So I think space is like that. I think it's the next internet. And I think the opportunities are going to keep coming out, and it's going to be, how do you monetize the 7 billion people on Earth from things that are in space?
I love that. And actually, you know, you sharing that and that story, I think it's a two-way thing. What's the technology in space that would have a different application on Earth, and what's on Earth that you have? You might even be a space company, you just don't know it yet, from something that you have here. And what a perfect note to wrap up on. I just want to thank all of our panelists today. This has been a great conversation to unpack it. And if you've had a chance to look in the chat and see the feedback, people have been just so excited to hear from you and hear your thoughts and I guess your experience and your wisdom and your advice in this space. So I just want to thank you for your time and the generosity of your time and your wisdom and sharing it with us today. We are excited about what each one of you is doing in your own companies and organizations. We want to support that. We want to contribute to that and help you as best we can, and see you really, you know, achieve the visions that you have, because they're really big visions and huge enablers, and we're very excited about it. To all of those that have joined us today, thank you for your time and thank you for being part of this. We'll be following up with a survey and some links to our panelists and some of the work that we've talked about today and some of the things that they've mentioned. And we'll also follow up if you want to stay in touch with us, and if you want to get in touch with anybody here and you haven't figured out how to do that, please just reach out to us on our website, cicadainnovations.com. Thanks everybody. Have a great afternoon.